Yo, 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 what up? It is I, your proverbial boy Jeffy, here in Vancouver, British Columbia, standing in front of the world-famous digital orca statue. I don't know if it's world famous, but it's certainly famous to me. And what I want to talk to you about today is something that I call a philosophy of emotions. Now, in my upcoming program, Charisma Mastery, I talk about the so-called human energy system. And what I'm talking about there is the various components that come together to form your communicative system. Now, those components include both the external projective modes that you have, which, would be first the vocal mode, right? How you talk, how you use musicality of language to color the words that you speak. The facial emotional complex, aka eye contact, the focus process, the musculature of the face that come into play when you're trying to project specific emotional messages to other people. And then, of course, your gestures, your movement through space, and touch that comprise what I call the kinesthetic mode. Right? These are the external projective modes. Above these, you then have the intellectual mode, which is your mind, which observes, analyzes, makes discerning creative choices, and of course can judge, which brings up a lot of the problems that we encounter when we're attempting to communicate with people charismatically. Above that, you've got the inner emotional process. Above that, you've got the intuitive process or intuition. Above that, you've got what you might call the higher observer. And all of these draw on an energy from above that you might call universal energy, life force, chi. There are many names for it. Essentially a transcendent experience, a transcendent form of energy that informs, creates our body and mind, and again, informs and travels through and out as we communicate. So how to speak to all of the issues surrounding this interrelationship between intuitive and intellectual resources and projective resources, this is probably the most fundamental challenge that faces anybody that's attempting to improve their communication skills. Now, all of these modes matter, but for many people, the emotional process is paramount. Because why? It affects them to an unhealthy extent. Right? So it's important to understand this emotional process. And to that end, today, as I said, I want to examine a so-called philosophy of emotions. And the purposes for understanding your inner emotional process are manifold, right? First of all, you want to have and develop and cultivate a conscious awareness of when you are becoming emotional. And there are 3 stages of awareness that you'll move through. And the first is when, you're aware that you're in an emotional state. You're like, I'm in it, I'm in the grip of it, and I can't do much about it. And, again, if you're going out trying to meet people, you might call this approach anxiety, where you're paralyzed and you can't take action. And you know it, but you can't do anything about it. That's the first stage. The second stage, as you develop greater awareness, is an awareness that you're entering the state, right? Like it's happening right now. It's actively happening right now. I'm entering the state. And then finally, you want to get to the third stage, where you develop an awareness that you're about to enter it. You're like, it's about to happen. And at that point, you can take action. Right? And, to prevent that from actually taking hold of you and you getting lost in the grip of that avoidant anxiety behavior. And that might be training an incompatible behavior, which is taking action before it can take hold. Okay? So that's the first thing, developing awareness. The second purpose here is cultivating an ability to control your behavior and control your communication while you're feeling emotional. Okay? Now, the third sort of aim here is you want to actually start to develop an emotional acuity. And what I'm talking about there is you're developing a perceptual capacity to determine what other people are feeling on a moment-to-moment basis as you interact with them, right? So like I said, we have 3 projective modes, the vocal, the facial, and the kinesthetic, but those also have corresponding perceptual modes, right? Hearing, seeing, and feeling, that you can, again, develop as you interact with people. And interestingly enough, the more that you develop your projective capacities, the more that your perceptual capacities will develop in tandem, okay? Because those 3 projective modes, they form a system of external communication. And then the 3 perceptual modes, they also form their own system. And then the interplay of those 2 systems together forms an overarching system as well. And so the fourth skill that you want to develop is learning how to use this information that you pick up from that emotional perceptual ability to actually modulate your approach in real time as you interact with people. And again, the emotional wavelengths unfold dynamically to sort of ride the wave and carry things forward to your desired goal. Your desired horizontal plot development goal, whatever that might be, whether it's getting intimate with somebody or maybe, closing the deal, negotiating, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're talking about emotions, I guess the best way to describe emotions would be as biological functions of our nervous system. Now, it's really interesting to think, it's a curious thought experiment to ask yourself, what is it about these particular mental states that we call emotions that makes them so special? Like, why do they get their own category of mental state? So if you think about it, neurologically, different emotions are controlled by different neural systems in the brain, right? The system that alerts us to danger is a different system in the brain than the system that is used in reproduction and creating, sexual arousal. There is no common emotional system in the brain. And furthermore, all of these emotional systems, if you look throughout different species, they're very consistent across many, many different species, whether it's lizards, whether it's amphibians, whether it's fish, whether it's mammals. And they're very consistent throughout many, many levels of evolutionary history. And when an animal that's capable of sentience, when an animal that has conscious awareness experiences these responses, that's when subjective emotional feelings occur, right? So the danger system gets activated, you move away from whatever's causing it, and then you subjectively experience the feeling we call fear. Now, we're not sure if all animals actually experience subjective fear, however. We don't know if fish have feelings, so to speak. I believe that was a Nirvana song. It's okay to eat fish because they don't have any feelings, but we don't really know, right? We don't really know if a frog has feelings. You look at your dog and you're pretty sure that they have feelings, but again, does a lizard? We don't really know. So moving things forward a little bit, when we're talking about conscious feelings of emotions, ultimately, these aren't really any different than any other states of consciousness, such as my awareness that this statue behind me represents an orca. Okay, so the difference between the state of recognizing a sea mammal and the state of feeling fear, it's not the system that represents the conscious content, fear or sea mammal, but the systems that provide input to that awareness. We've only got one mode of conscious awareness, right? The intellect. And that intellectual space can be occupied with facts, like it's cold, my hands are cold, there's music playing, I'm in Vancouver, et cetera, et cetera. There's steam coming out of my breath, right? That, again, that mental space can be occupied with those kind of boring facts, or it can be occupied with emotional feelings. Now, emotional feelings have the ability to take over the conscious space very, very easily. But conversely, it's kind of interesting to note that the boring facts can't bump emotions out quite as easily. All events that are perceived by the intellect are a result of lower brain processes that we aren't actually aware of, right? That are taking place in the so-called cognitive unconscious. And these processes there's a multitude of them, and they range from, again, routine analysis of input from our sensory systems, again, hearing the music, feeling the temperature, to our memory, to remembering things, to imagining things that aren't present, to decision making, et cetera, et cetera. Now, since our behavior is produced ultimately by these unconscious systems, well, turns out we do all kinds of things all the time for reasons that we are not consciously aware of. This is something that's utterly fascinating to me, right? One of the main roles of the intellectual mode or consciousness is to make our life into a coherent story, right? To give us a concept of identity and a concept of self. And it actually does this by creating explanations of behavior that that are based on our self-image, our memories, expectations of the future, the present social situation, the physical environment, et cetera, et cetera. I read a case study, and as I was researching all of this, the neurology behind emotions, the neuroscience behind emotions, of a patient who had severe epilepsy. And oftentimes when you have a patient with severe epilepsy, as a last ditch resort, they'll do a radical surgery where they separate the two lobes of the brain, the two hemispheres of the brain, so they can't communicate with each other in an attempt to reduce the severity of the seizures. And so again, once this is done, the surgery is done, the two brains can't communicate with one another. And again, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, so I may not be getting this exactly right, but one case study they had was, with a patient who had this surgery done, was they presented stimulus to the side of the brain that is incapable of speech, right? So I forget which one it is, the right or the left. Let's just, again, I think it's the right brain. So they presented, a stimulus. They'd say, okay, wave at someone across the street or laugh. Then they would ask them, why did you do that? The part of the brain that can produce vocal content was the part of the brain that they did not present the information to. So that side of the brain, again, that was responsible for generating the vocal output, it didn't know what the input was. So, it just saw the body doing the activity. And then subsequently they asked him, why did you do that? Like, why did you wave? They said, oh, I saw someone I knew. Or they asked him, okay, well, why did you laugh? And the patient said, because you guys are really funny. So what was fascinating was that even though this side of the brain that could speak didn't know why they were doing it, it came up with a reason out of thin air to justify it. So again, it's interesting how the intellect can make up reasons for unconscious behavior out of thin air to kind of justify and create a sense of self. So when we're talking about these unconscious behaviors, it's important to understand that emotions are things that happen to us, okay? They're not things that we're actually consciously willing to occur. Now, of course, you can set up certain situations to generate emotions that you want, right? Like, going to the movies or, eating your favorite food or drinking alcohol or ingesting drugs, whatever. But in those situations, really what you're doing, you're just arranging external events so that the stimuli that trigger the emotions that you want are present. Now, conversely, it's interesting to note, the phenomenon of how motion creates emotion. And this is something that I employ in my life coachings all the time and personally as well. And what this is it's the fact that when you change your physiology to match any one of the universal expressions of emotion, it will literally trigger that emotion in you. So again, if I'm out and I'm feeling a little stifled, I'm feeling a little bit in my head, so to speak, I might actually just put a little smile on my face, right? Or I'll start moving to the music. I'll do a conscious check for tension, relax it, make a conscious effort to relax it, kind of move to the, the beat of the music, et cetera, et cetera. And it's interesting because I might realize, when I've done this in the past, I've realized, you know what? You're fucking faking this. This isn't real, right? You're faking this. But if you keep it up, ultimately the actual emotion, that will trigger the actual emotion. You'll start feeling better, and then you can move forward and take action. So, one interesting thing about this whole, these whole emotional responses is that once you're in the grip of an emotion, it can actually block access to certain information that might, prove it incorrect. So instead, what we do is we solely focus on information that confirms it, that supports it, and says, yes, you should continue to be afraid. You should continue to be angry. So if you're scared to approach somebody, you're only going to focus on the reasons why you shouldn't. Right? Not the reasons why the fear is unrealistic. You literally will not be able to access any information that would contradict that fear. They call this the refractory period, right? It's a period where you're actively influenced by the emotion. And this period can last a couple of minutes or it can last much, much longer. And if it's too long, it actively begins to color how you perceive the world and how you perceive yourself. And now you've got a personality disorder, perhaps. So one thing that I see very commonly in my line of work is just people have a generalized anxiety that prevents them from taking action, right? And this so-called approach anxiety, it's characterized by a general avoidance response, right? That they've learned at some point and then they just reinforce through habit. And this avoidance response is then performed automatically when the appropriate stimulus is encountered. So for example, as soon as they go into the club and as soon as they hear the music and see the crowd, boom, it just triggers the avoidance response. Now, we have a couple different types of emotional trigger. We have learned innate emotional fear responses that are universal. For example, you see a snake, or you see a spider, or you see an object hurtling quickly at you through space. It just has a fear trigger that happens immediately. But there's also learned emotional fear responses, right? And these avoidance responses, interestingly enough, they can be somewhat arbitrarily related to danger. So anything that reduces the exposure to the fear eliciting events can become an avoidance response. And in the case of, again, socializing, it's just they freeze up, right? You know, again, you're in it. You know you should be, intellectually, you know you should be taking action, but that emotion has been triggered and it has taken over your conscious awareness and you cannot move, you cannot take action, right? Basically what's happening here is the brain has learned a response that can be performed in the presence of a learned trigger that short circuits the innate response, right? It short circuits the innate, fear response. So this can be quite helpful from an evolutionary standpoint, right? So for example, let's say you're an animal on the African savanna and you learn that if you go to that certain water hole, there are lions there, right? If you learn that, you can avoid going there. However, if you stop going to any water holes at all because you get anxious whenever you start looking for water, now the avoidance response has become harmful to your life. Now you're not getting hydrated enough, et cetera, et cetera. Now you got an anxiety disorder. So the parallels in social interaction, and so-called approach anxiety are very, very obvious here. This ability of our brain to form memories of stimuli that are associated with the danger and retain them for long periods of time and call on them automatically when similar situations occur in the future, that's a powerful survival tool. But sometimes it's counterproductive, especially in modern civilization. Like, what is so useful about being afraid to talk to somebody? It's like, yeah, there may be some risk involved with it, but the chances of it causing you active harm are usually so minuscule as to be negligible, right? It's like 0.00001% of the time it might actually cause a problem for you. So with behavioral therapy, if somebody has, the symptoms of anxiety, behavioral therapy will try to get rid of it through various forms of what they call extinction therapy. And I do this myself in my life coaching programs. Basically, it's a process of systematic desensitization through exposure to frightening situations, right? Starting with less frightening ones and working up towards more frightening ones. So for example, if this weekend, I've got a couple of clients, they've never gone out in their entire life. And it's their first time actually doing interaction. So, they have a lot of anxiety around it. So I'm not expecting these guys to go up and, be the most charismatic person ever. I just want them to go talk to someone. Even if they get blown off immediately, they're like, okay, hey, I'm still here. I'm still corporeal. I haven't been vaporized. And then I start to, try to get them to extend the interactions longer and longer. So by doing that, again, this so-called extinction therapy through exposure to increasingly frightening situations, ultimately you create a new conditioned response, which is no response. So this extinction therapy, ultimately it's a way of creating brain pathways that control the amygdala, right? And the amygdala is the part of your brain which is actually responsible for storing and also for activating these fear triggers. Now, what's interesting to note here is the amygdala's emotional memories are indelible. They are burned into the circuits. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to remove these triggers once they're created, at least to the best of our knowledge today, right? Today, again, the best we can hope to do is to regulate their expression. And the way that we do this is by getting the cortex, okay, the intellect, to kind of start to control the amygdala. And basically, when you're exposing yourself to progressively more frightening experiences, this is a form of implicit learning involving the prefrontal amygdala circuit, right? Now, it's very, very well known in neuroscience that the connections from the cortical areas, to the amygdala are far, far weaker than the connections from the amygdala to the cortex. Like from the amygdala to the cortex, very strong connections, very strong wiring. But again, from here back down, that hasn't really evolved yet. So this might explain why it's so easy for emotional information to kind of overwhelm our consciousness, but it's very, very difficult for us to gain conscious control over our emotions, right? This asymmetry in connections between the cortex and the amygdala, it might explain why it's so difficult to reduce our anxiety when we're approaching people that we don't know. Now, interestingly enough, some people, they can actually learn to enjoy fear. Like some crazy motherfuckers, like, they do base jumping, or extreme parkour on like a skyscraper, extreme sports aficionados, but they're a special case, right? So to kind of wrap things up here, we all experience the same emotions, but every person experiences them uniquely, differently. So in the development of your expressive capacities, it's important to understand our basic emotional processes, begin to understand what triggers them, and how to recognize these processes in yourself and others, and ultimately how to use this information in your actual interactions as they develop dynamically from moment to moment, right? It's very, very hard to change the things that we get emotional about. You got to start to look within and identify your hot triggers and understand all the variables that might affect your ability to resist or reduce their power over you. And the main key here is to develop awareness, right? Like I said at the very beginning, you want to just start to develop awareness so you can recognize the onset of one of these emotional episodes before you're, fully in the grip of it, or you're fully in that refractory period where your RAS, your reticular activation system, can only focus on those things that reinforce the emotion, right? So the exercises in the Charisma Mastery program, as well as meditation, yoga, many other approaches, can actually help us in this process. But the big thing here, and I always reiterate this, is don't feel guilt, don't feel shame at being overly affected by any of these entanglements, or overly affected by your inner emotional process. All that does is just reinforce the judgmental burden and just cause more problems, right? So you just want to simply identify and then begin the process of releasing the hold that these emotional responses have on you. When we experience a subjective emotional feeling, all that's happening there is we're just becoming aware that one of the unconscious emotional systems of the brain, for example, the defense system, is active. And for this to happen, we need a couple things, right? We need, number one, the defense system itself, and number two, the capacity for us to be consciously aware of its activity. So ultimately, to understand our feelings, we've got to understand how conscious experiences happen, right? So our conscious experience of the present, right, of the here and now, is reliant on our so-called working memory, which can, you can kind of think of as an all-purpose temporary storage system that we use when we're actively thinking about something. So like what we know about the one present moment, right? For example, again, that I'm on the waterfront, it's kind of cold, I'm hearing music, there's people around me, I'm in North America, et cetera, et cetera. What we know about this moment is basically what is in our working memory. And that essentially allows us to know that the here and now is here and is happening now, if that makes sense, right? In other words, consciousness is the awareness of what's happening and what's being held in our working memory. So the conscious and unconscious aspects of thought, one very interesting description I heard was that there are sort of like serial and parallel functions, right? Our consciousness, it seems to do things serially, right? One at a time, while all of the various unconscious processes that happen underneath seem to operate in parallel. So what we think of as our intellectual mode might actually be just a kind of limited capacity serial processor that sits at the top of the cognitive hierarchy above a variety of specialized processors below it that are organized in parallel. Again, like the sensory input, memory, et cetera, the emotional processes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, serial processors, they actually create representations by manipulating symbols, and we're only conscious of information that's represented symbolically. The information processing by the lower level parallel processors, that's occurring, I guess, sub-symbolically, that is, in codes that are not decipherable to us consciously. So our working memory, quote unquote, is that serial processor that creates and manipulates symbolic representations. In other words, it's a very, very crucial part of the system that allows consciousness, aka the intellectual mode. But of course, that's a topic for a different video. And I actually explore all of these ideas in extreme depth in my Charisma Mastery program. And not just from an academic standpoint, but through the eyes of somebody who's been teaching social skills live in the field, in the real world, every weekend for 17 years. And as I researched all this stuff, I looked at it through the filter of how can this be directly applied in real life based on what I've seen from both myself and my students over the course of my entire career, as it were, right? It's all very practical and extremely applicable. And I've also developed an exercise process to identify and train any weaknesses you might have in any one of those components of the communicative system, right? Isolate them, exercise them, and then reintegrate them into a more completely realized whole, that's completely free of tension and completely free of any kind of entanglements or blocks, so you can be actually free to execute the techniques that you know you should be, but you maybe haven't been able to in the past because of those internal blocks. You know, these are blocks that you likely weren't even aware of, as they're so frequently, you know, sub-threshold. You know, I see it all the time. I had these guys last weekend in Toronto. This one guy, I'm like, yo, just stand in front of the people you're speaking to and look them in the eye. Can you do that? And he could not do it. He couldn't do it. And he's like, I'm doing it. I'm like, no, you're not doing it. He's like, I'm not? And I started taking pictures of him standing to the side. I'm like, no, see, you're not doing it. He's like, oh, okay, you're gonna do it on the next one? Yeah, and then he just couldn't do it. Again, he's unaware of these tensions, these entanglements. He's unaware of why he can't do it, but on a certain level, he knows he should be, but he's just paralyzed, right? You're just absolutely paralyzed, and you know you should be taking action, but somehow you can't because of these, again, processes and blocks that are below your threshold of awareness. So you just feel like a punk ass. You know, you just feel like a punk. You know you should be doing it. You don't know why, and you just beat yourself up, right? But again, that's not what this is all about. It's just about awareness, identification of these blocks, you know, through exercise, and then through further exercise, strengthening them in isolation, reintegrating them into a more completely realized whole for powerful, completely expressive and charismatic communication. So the full program comes out in February, and I'm also going to be debuting a live program where you can actually come and release these entanglements in a group setting, which is extremely helpful, okay? So head over to charismamastery.com right now, get on that VIP list, and you'll be informed of all the developments that are leading up to the release date. It's been Jeffy, and I'll see you next time.
Definitely learned a lot just to be able to connect with people a lot better. Jeffy's really studied down to the roots of how we're so stifled and you have these entanglements inside you and how to release them. I definitely recommend this program for other people to take a deeper look within themselves. Jeffy's program is amazing.
This program is extremely exercise-based. It's designed to give you a process to identify these weaknesses in your communicative system, to open and sustain charismatic expression, charismatic communication with increasing consistency. All sensory communication is based on some relationship of these three perceptual and projective modes. Any art involving human communication is going to benefit from knowing how the communicating power of each mode can be enhanced. Charisma and conversational skill really hasn't had a vocabulary for talking about these issues surrounding the technique. Most of the books you read, the vast majority of them are very surface level, very hokey. And even with experienced teachers, the feedback can often be very subjective and vague. You seem kind of stifled. So I want to change the way that these criticisms or descriptions are verbalized and get very, very specific. So when we're talking about these blockages, we know precisely what we're talking about here.
If you follow the instructions, you see something very net and precise that happens. You're going to see the result instantaneous.
The best charisma program I've ever seen.
So I learned something which is very rare.
How do people use their energies when they communicate? How can I help them become masters of those energies? So when you go out and you feel that blockage, that inability to act, oh, there's the person I want to talk to. I know how to go talk to them. I've read the theories, I've watched all the videos, but I can't take action. What's impeding the flow? Remove the obstacles, isolate the skills, exercise them separately, then put them together, back together in a more completely realized whole.
Unleashes your true charisma.
And in fact, you have some glimpse of energy you can manage on the wall side. Increase it, decrease it, manage it. Seriously, it was absolutely amazing and astonishing.
How to speak to all the issues surrounding this interrelationship between intuitive and intellectual resources is arguably the most fundamental challenge facing anyone who's attempting to improve their communication skills. So this program intends to prepare your total instrument to open and communicate freely, but also teach you to let go.
He will take you by the hand and guide you step by step with his method that he's been trying and improving, and you're gonna get the results that you wanna be looking for.
Overall, this was a really broad spectrum course in charisma. I think I could apply it in my dating life, also in business and other areas of my life. So if you're looking to develop general charisma that you can apply across all areas of life, definitely check out Jeff's Charisma Mastery.